So good evening, everyone. My name is Katharine Henderson. I'm the president of Auburn Seminary in New York City. And I'm so looking forward to tonight's conversation about the role of faith in our democratic society. You know, historically, faith has been a driver and a catalyst for progressive social change, and that's no less true today. And especially at a time we're in the really amidst of a crisis of confidence in so many of our civic institutions. I'm going to be joined here by three leaders of faith representing a variety of beliefs and backgrounds, experiences, and opinions. But we're all united, I think, in seeing faith as a catalyst and driver of creating a world of human flourishing and flourishing for the planet herself. And we want to explore how faith has a role in playing a larger and more impactful and positive role when it comes to tackling the real challenges that are before us. So I want to introduce the panelists. Reverend Jennifer Bailey is an ordained minister, public theologian, and the founder and executive director of Faith Matters Network, a womanist-led organization equipping community organizers, faith leaders, and activists with resources for connection, spiritual sustainability, and accompaniment. She was one of 15 faith leaders named by the Center for American Progress, Faith Leaders to Watch. She's an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and serves locally on the staff of the Greater Bethel AME Church in Nashville, Tennessee. Welcome, Jen.
Thanks so much for having me.
Reverend Mitchell Hescox is the president of the Evangelical Environmental Network. He guides a team representing over 4 million pro-life Christians who understand climate change as the greatest moral challenge of our time and the greatest opportunity for hope in building sustainable prosperity for all. Prior to joining the Evangelical Environmental Network, Reverend Hescox pastored a local church for 18 years, and before the call to ordained ministry served as the coal and utility industry as director fuel systems for Alice Mineral Systems in York, Pennsylvania. Reverend Hescox co-authored Caring for Creation, the Evangelical Guide to Climate Change and a Healthy Environment, with nationally known meteorologist Paul Douglas. Welcome, Mitch.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
And Dr. Simran Singh was recognized among Time Magazine's 16 people fighting for a more equal America. He's senior advisor for equity and inclusion at YSC Consulting and a visiting professor at Union Seminary in New York. He's a 2020 Equality Fellow with the Open Society Foundations, a Racial Equity Media Fellow with Interfaith Youth Coalition, and a Senior Fellow for the Sikh Coalition. Growing up as a turban-wearing, brown-skinned, beard-loving Sikh in South Texas, Simran learned early that marginalized groups will not lecture their way into dignity and that empathy is truly built when people get to know each other as human beings. He's the author of a recent best-selling book for children, Fauja Singh Keeps Going, the oldest person to ever run a marathon. So welcome, Simran.
Thank you, Katharine.
So let's get going here. So this past year, what can we say about this past year? It's been an incredible year and a test for American democracy, a brutal contested election, the aftermath of which we're still living through, a global pandemic with COVID and a pandemic of racial reckoning, a deadly insurrection at the US Capitol, and record-breaking voter turnout. So what role do we as leaders in our communities of faith have to play in building a more just and democratic society, especially in a moment like this one? So what do you see as your role and the role of faith for such a time as this? And anybody can jump in. This is a conversation.
I think one of the things, just going back to the question we had this morning, is to think about Robert Putnam's new book, The Upswing, How Americans Get Together. I think it's a pivotal look at how faith can get together. You know, one of the things that he talks about in his book is how in the 1870s and 80s, American society became very individualistic, very disunioned. And I think one of the things that drove it back together again was the heart of being people together. From my perspective, it was the evangelical roots to the social gospel movement, how that brought people together, turned about caring about social justice, caring about the poor. And I think as faith leaders, one of the great things we can do together is to emphasize that nature of the community aspect of coming together to help one another. And I think that's a good starting place for us to begin, is that the faith is important, is a role, and not just individualism, but just the opposite, being a community together.
Thanks, Mitch. What do you all think about that, Jen and Simran? Go ahead and jump in.
Sure. I think that's right. And as I was thinking about the question, Katharine, one thing that was at the forefront of my mind as you were describing the conditions that we find ourselves in a post-2020 world is that there are a whole lot of people in this moment who are deeply in a space of grief and mourning, mourning for what they thought was the American dream, mourning for a particular way of life that they assumed they would have. There are folks who are literally mourning the death of loved ones in the midst of this horrible global pandemic. And one thing I think the world's great religious traditions bring to a conversation around collective grief and memory are rituals and practices that have been time tested and proved, ways of being together and being in community in the greatest moments of folks' lives and the darkest moments of folks' lives. And so as I think about the unique call of faith communities in this season of deep collective grief, I am really aware of the ways in which ritual practices can help us inform and move through this moment in such a way as to see the possibility of what might be present on the other side as we really do strive to create a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, knowing that we are going to have moments of tension, moments of grief, and unfortunately, I think moments of death before us. What is it that we can plumb from these great traditions that can help us speak into this season of our nation's life in a way that is reifying and edifying and not, I think I want to use the term, trying to be careful with my words here, that doesn't replicate harm, but rather pours into folks a sense of deep healing, because we also know that our traditions have been responsible for some of the divisions that we see in our country right now. And so I think that there's a balance to strike there if we're honest with ourselves about both the gifts and some of the areas of growth that we can communicate through our faith.
Yeah, I think that's such an important, it's such an important perspective and such an important contribution, especially in the current context of American life, where we are realizing individually and collectively that we're more connected than we've ever been before, right? If we think about technology or globalization, we've never been more connected as a society, and yet we feel so disconnected. And what do we do in this moment where we feel like we don't know the people around us and we don't know ourselves, right? I think if we're using these cliches constantly around revelation, right? We're saying what the last few years have revealed to us are cracks underneath the surface that have always been there. And so when those come to the surface and we have to grapple with them, and we don't know where to go and we don't know what to do, then where do we look? Where do we look for wisdom that will guide us? And I think that's what our religious traditions and our religious leadership has to bring to our current moment, right? Like, there are these incredible questions of introspection that we're all undergoing. What does it look like to practice justice? What does it look like to fight hate with love? What does it look like to truly love our neighbors? These are questions we're all asking ourselves, and our traditions have the wisdom. We have the value systems available to us, and we have the vision. We have seen what it looked like to put these into practice. And so to take those models and apply them to today's world where we feel so lost and confused and uncertain about what to do, I think that gives us incredible guidance at a time when we need it very badly.
Can I ask each of you to be more specific? Paint a little picture here for those of us who are listening in. Mitch, let's start with you since you started out. What would, from your perspective, what would be a communitarian response? The community response that you're looking for, that you clearly have in your mind, that overrides individualism?
I mean, I think from the Christian tradition and my tradition, Jesus gave us 2 great commandments: to love God and love our neighbor. And I think putting that into action, that loving God and loving the neighbor are really on the same platform. And how do we love our neighbor? It's not just waving at them as we go down the street. It's helping them if they're ill. It's those who are neighbors who are far away that are in need of sustainable jobs and cleaning up the foul pollution that in our environmental justice community is direct havoc in America. And so that's what I like to think about this idea of sustainable economy, that it's portraying that everybody has equal opportunity and equal viability into living in a place that has clean air and clean water and those good paying jobs. We don't have a place anymore where, right now in America, 1 in 9 children are born prematurely because of soot, PM 2.5. In the African American community, that number is double. 1 in 5 children are born, and 1/3 of infants die that are born prematurely by statistically. And so it's that idea of being cooperative together. It's loving one another and seeing that love is a tangible and fundamental expression of our faith and not hate. That we have to instill that message of love and put that love into tangible action.
Thank you. And Jen, you talked a little bit about ritual and the wisdom of our traditions. What do you have in mind? Rituals of grief or rituals, wisdom that can be brought to this moment?
Absolutely. I'm reminded of a scripture in the Psalms that says, "You've turned my mourning into dancing for me." And I do think that one of the great offerings of our traditions is this notion of sitting in the midst of the hard stuff with one another. And that includes death. And so I'll give you an example. Last year at it seems like so long ago, but as we were approaching 100,000 deaths in the United States to COVID-19, there had not been really a public outcry. This was before the New York Times published their Sunday edition that had 1,000 names and bios on the front page. And a group of really everyday citizens, and some who were faith leaders, some not, decided to do a public vigil called Naming the Loss, where for 24 hours online, we just read the names of people who'd passed away as a moment and way of demarcating time. And I would argue, in sort of my cosmology, suspending time to pay attention to the real human toll that the pandemic was playing. And as I think about those moments of strategic intervention that people of faith and people of spirit, so folks who may not affiliate with a formal religious tradition, but for whom spirit is at the core of who they are and how they operate and move in the world and relate to one another, I think that there is a real opportunity for us to build on some of those practices, whether it be just calling the names or, I'm in the Black church tradition, so notions of call and response are really important to us in the way that we do worship. I also would lift up, I've been really moved by the work of chaplains in this season. So not just traditional chaplains, although I think there have been heroic efforts in places like hospitals over the past year and a half that chaplains have been leading, but also folks who are on sort of the forefront of innovating how we think about chaplaincy. And for folks who are watching who are maybe not familiar with the framework of chaplaincy, so the role of a chaplain is to really serve as the person who's accompanying folks during some of the best and worst moments in their life. So hospitals often have chaplains, the military have chaplains. And our work at Faith Matters Network, we've been working on this concept of the social movement chaplain, right? But I think what is being born in this moment out of, I come from a tradition that out of death comes new life. And as we've seen the decline of traditional religious institutions, in particular mainline Christianity in the past 30 years, I think I've seen this rising up of new roles arising to meet the moment, whether that be chaplaincy and innovative places. I was talking to a rabbi recently from Northern Virginia who said, we need chaplains for democracy right now. And I think that that's true, right? Because even before we can get to a place of collective action, I think we need to do some collective truth telling about the histories and sharp realities that have gotten us to this point in American history. And we need somebody who's going to be able to sit with folks as they reckon with that truth, right? I often wonder at a time where we are debating whether or not a phrase like Black Lives Matter is something that we should accept, right? Like, what is the defensive posture that has folks, and I will say from my experience, sometimes Christian folks, I'm going to speak to my own people because I can't speak to anybody else, reject that phrase, right? That defensiveness is not just about a racialized reality, but there's something deeper there. I would argue is a soul issue. And so that's why we need some good trained folks who know how to care for people, who know how to sit with folks in the midst of all of their darkness to help them reckon with what's really up for them personally and interpersonally.
Simran, are there rituals or wisdom from your tradition, the Sikh tradition, that would speak to this moment in particular? We try to build a multiracial, multi-faith democracy where everyone can flourish and belong.
Yeah, I love the question, and I'm happy to share a couple of reflections, especially things that I've been grappling with this past year personally. And one of the greatest, I think, breakthroughs for me this past year has been this challenge of, our family we're based in New York City. My wife is a physician, and we were very close to leaving the city when the pandemic first hit. And I was trying to convince her to leave. And she said, you know what, our faith teaches us that the most important thing we can do is serve those who are most vulnerable. And I can't leave right now in a moment where people need me the most. And I admired that. And I also sort of lamented that we were infected pretty much immediately. And our kids got very sick. And the entire experience of the first few months was very self-absorbed, and rightfully so. We were very concerned about our health and staying safe and keeping our kids safe. And what I found was, as I started to get wrapped up in my own world, it was very difficult to come out, and I had no idea how to stop obsessing over my own well-being. And there was a tension here. There was a paradox, because one of the things that we all realized this past year with the COVID-19 pandemic is that our well-being is literally bound up with one another's. Right? We are that connected, that our literal health is connected with one another. And so in this moment of struggle, of personal struggle, myself, I turned to something within my tradition which says the way out is through service. And it's something I've learned my whole life, but it felt so counterintuitive in this moment, which meant, in my head, I was thinking, I want other people to take care of me. What do I have to give other people in this moment? But I trusted the tradition, and I began serving And what I found was, and in retrospect, it's more clear to me now how this works. What I found was, as I was able to begin connecting with other people suffering, I was then able to recognize my own privileges. I was able to get away from my own egocentric view of the world where everything revolved around me. And most importantly, I was able to start breaking down some of the barriers that I'd created in my head about what separated me from the people around me. And I think, that was a breakthrough for me with regard to the pandemic, but that's something our entire country could use in so many different aspects, right? The barriers we've built along the lines of race, along the lines of religious difference, along the lines of gender, all these oppressive systems that we've created, how do we break them down? It begins with a practice of connecting with one another. And I think service is both the vehicle to get us there and also then the process by which we are able to dismantle these oppressive systems.
Thank you. This is fascinating. So Mitch, I'm going to come back to you and to the whole group here with a sort of related question, and that is, each of you has talked about sort of bridge building, bridging to others. I know that Jen, in some of your writing and speaking, you talk about border crossing, that building a bridge requires resources that not everybody has. Crossing a border requires a personal journey. So we actually are representative of some varied perspectives of possibly some of the divisions actually that are in the country. I mean, we come from different faith traditions. We have, I assume, different perspectives on political matters, on faith matters. So talk a little bit about how you do this bridge building or border crossing. How do you develop empathy? How do we build a democratic society where we actually can speak to each other and appreciate each other, which is something beyond sort of getting along or tolerating others?
Well, for me, and asking this, I think it begins with respect of one another. Learning who other people are, getting the chance to talk to people who are different than you are. And I think that's where it all begins. And different, I can recall, I mean, obviously I'm an old white man, evangelical to boot, who, many would consider in this nation to be very privileged. And I admit that I am. And one of the most interesting experiences in my life happened mid-1980s, when first trip I made to India. It was a time of civil unrest in India. The BHP party was raising up. There was a class warfare where for people of different classes, the higher classes were setting themselves on fire. All sorts of just interesting phenomenon in social unrest. And I was in Delhi, and I was out with a young Indian engineer. I was still in the mining business, and went out on a visit to the Red Fort. And all of a sudden, I was surrounded by about 25, 30 young men, probably 18 to 20 years old, just yelling and screaming at me. And I had no idea what they were telling me until after they broke up and dismissed, and they were calling me Britisher. They believed because of my white skin that I was English, responsible for the colonialism that has destroyed and still impacts India today. And for 2 seconds, I understood what it meant to be a minority. Certainly wasn't my entire life. But I think that moment changed my life to understand, to look for the differences in people and how we can get along. I mean, our Bible tells us that, for justice to roll down like a river and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And it's interesting that those words are sort of ideals of justice, really meaning how things are done in the kingdom of God and God's relationship. And righteousness is how they're lived out among people on earth. And I do believe that it becomes with, I think people haven't recognized yet today that it's okay to love someone even if they're different than you. It's okay to love someone if they have a different religious tradition. It's one of the reasons that in my community, I don't do any interfaith events, because that personally gets me in trouble, because, my people don't believe that all religions are equal. but I can do a multi-faith event because everybody knows that there are different faiths. And it's okay to let people experience that there are different traditions and different cultures, and it all really begins with respecting. And I think even as part of the conference, one of the things that, as we look towards, the money in politics as part of it, that has been fueled, that the breaking apart, that keeping of individualism has just been fueled by the massive amounts of money for disinformation. And I think that just adds literally, gasoline to the fire. And that's one of the things I think we really should be talking about, is that we break upon respect when social media, news media outlets try to continue to break that fiber just to cause that division.
So you've made a bridge here actually to another topic that we wanted to bridge to, and that is this idea of individualism, communitarianism. I would say that all beings are made in the image of God and deserve dignity. And all of this is playing out in both the voting, voter suppression, voting rights issues, and legislative actions across the country. It's also playing out in the issue of money in politics, big money in politics, that can override the voices of individuals, the votes of individuals, and particularly those who are on the margins of our society, from whom we mostly need to hear, whose voices are often unheard. So let's talk a little bit about this issue of money in politics. And Jen, you want to jump in here?
Sure. I was actually looking at Simran because I feel like you have much more to say about this money in politics question than I might. I might actually just backtrack just a moment to talk a little bit more about this sort of border crossing, bridge building space, because I think before we can even get to a place of discussing the particularities of policy like money in politics, we have to think about whether or not we're talking about common and shared values. And so I just want to lift up and amplify my work. I've learned so much from Chicana and Latinx scholars and folks, I'm looking at Simran, folks from Texas, right, who have been thinking about and theorizing about the border for a very long time. I look at the work of Gloria Azadua and others who have been really thinking about what it means to operate in that space of the borderlands, and also thinking about a bishop that I've gotten to know recently, Bishop Robert Shinesi of the United Methodist Church, who's there in Texas, right? And so these folks who've grown up on the border have taught us a lot about what it means to be in community with, in the in-between places, and to have what it means to wade into the muck of, if it will, whether it's the Rio Grande River or other spaces of the ish, right? And so I think when I think about bridge building work, we've so often point to or think about what's on the other end of the bridge or what we're bridging to. But I would argue that when we're thinking about bridge building across lines of difference, we also have to consider what's underneath the bridge. What are we actually trying to pass over in order to get to a collective understanding, and consider what that bridge is made of. I don't know about you, but if I'm dealing with a challenge like money in politics or voter suppression or white supremacy writ large, right? I don't want a bridge that's made of sticks. I want one that's made of steel, right? So to make sure it can withstand the heft of what we're wrestling with. And so I say all that to say, I think when we are considering what our shared and common values are, that might lead us to reach a conclusion that too much money in politics is not good for the health of our democracy. We have to backtrack first and have to interrogate. So what are naming what those values are? And I worry that we are at a place right now in the state of our politics and national discourse where we can't even get to the same table to discover that we have shared stories or common values. That's just how broken down we've become. And so again, I think I point to projects that are dedicated to helping us both have deeper conversations across lines of difference that are rooted in story and shared experience, and who empower us to listen differently. to hear and see the humanity in the other person that we might be engaging with who might be different from us as a basic starting point. And Simran and I were recently in another conversation where you taught me that like tolerance should be like the opening stance, right? If what we're building towards is tolerance, then we got a long way to go. And so I'm curious, Simran, what you're thinking about this question of how bridging connects to these bigger questions about the state of our politics and democracy.
Yeah, I mean, as always, I'll agree with everything that you just said and just try and build on it. And the build, I think, is why does it matter that we begin with this place of shared understanding? Because the nature of the inequities in our society are born out of an assumption and a conviction that some of us are better than others. I'm a historian of South Asia and of religion, and one of the things I focus on is the colonial period. And one of the standard justifications that European colonizers used as they traveled around the world and took over people was these people don't have access to the kind of rationality that we do. We can't trust them to create their own worlds. And actually, they can't trust themselves. They're better off if we make the decisions for them. Now, that's the same logic that is manifesting itself in modern America, where we allow and enable those with more power and more wealth to make decisions for the general public. So what's happening here? What's happening is that this is an issue of what happens when we allow those in power to continue justifying their manipulation of people on the basis of this assumption that they're better than them, right? This is supremacy. And it is a toxicity that has ravaged our world for centuries. This is the problem, right? And this is what happens when we don't actually know one another. And back to Mitch's standard point, or his earlier point, this is what happens when we don't love one another. When we don't love one another, we don't trust one another. When we don't trust one another, we make decisions for one another. And when we make decisions for one another, we do whatever the hell we want that benefits us and doesn't benefit everyone. And so this conversation, I think, is critical of what is the ethical grounding. What is the basis upon which we make decisions as a collective? Do we do that on the basis of self-interest and the seeking out of additional power? Or do we do it along the lines of justice and equity? And I think, anyone with a moral fiber in their body, whether they're religious or not, would clearly choose the second path. But the problem is we become so mired as a society within a system that reproduces power along the lines of injustice that we don't know what to do. And we're so lost. We've become so lost that we're unaware of how this is actually being reproduced over and over again. So to the point where it's hardly visible to us, right? Those who are producing these rules and placing their money, using their wealth to influence decisions that benefit them and harm the rest of us, we don't know it. We don't see it because the structures have created such a cloud around what's happening that we don't understand it. So there's a manipulation there for sure. There is a confusion for sure, but the underlying problem goes back to what Mitch and Jen have been saying, which is we haven't created the conditions to lift one another up and to live with love and justice, right? We're doing the opposite over and over again, and that's the cycle that we're trying to break.
I wonder, I'm curious because I would love Mitch's opinion on this, but as I go back to my Bible and start to suss through it, I realize that the God of my tradition, the Black church tradition within Christianity, is a God of abundance, right? So I see stories of manna coming from heaven to meet the needs of the people, literally, right? I hear the parable of the loaves and fishes, and I'm like, oh, I know that because I've seen people care for their own communities in that way. And I think it speaks to a theology of abundance that is true And yet, I feel like we operate in a bioethical worldview, particularly Christians in the United States, that is rooted in a theology of scarcity. There's only so much, and therefore we must compete over that. And so I'd be curious, Mitch, what you think about that and how that sits
No,
in your world.
I mean, I completely agree with you. And I think one of the ways that one of my greatest fears in this time of this new administration is exactly that. I mean, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, the son of and grandson of coal miners. I mean, I see what the coal economy is going through in West Virginia and Appalachia. And I also know what's happening in our urban areas and other areas that are more predominantly people of color. And I think one of the great areas that we need to see is that there is abundance of way of lifting up both communities, because I see a great propensity for the post-industrial communities of the rural area, Appalachia, having a war with people of urban cities and calling for environmental justice because of that scarcity mentality. And we do live in a God of abundance. And I think that's one of the primary teachings we have. And that scarcity comes out of fear. And I think you mentioned it earlier. And I think that's one of the greatest things that we have to overcome as faith leaders is this concept of fear. I mean, I often talk about, you mentioned Exodus. I mean, the Israelites were much willing to go back in Egypt because at least they knew how they were going to die there instead of going forward into a promised land, into the kingdom of God. And I think that's a really fundamental point of where we have to engage in this conversation, because it's much easier to engage people and let them play out their fear with the way we're using money today versus creating a system of hope and abundance for all people.
So when you get faith leaders together, we could talk a very long time. we could take over this whole summit, this whole conference, and keep going. But I'm going to ask a last question here, and that is, this conference is all about connecting, committing, and acting. So, and we're all coming out of this pandemic moment, trying to figure out how to be human beings together again. What is the very tangible thing that you could suggest to some of those who are listening that that an individual could do to commit and to connect and to act, to build some of those bridges, to cross some of those borders, to try to create a more cohesive, connected democracy? Because if we can't figure this out, there will be no democracy. What's something tangible? Bring it down to what anybody listening could do to take a step.
I'll offer two things that I try and practice every day. And that is, one, these are difficult things to practice. They're easy to start out with and difficult to sustain. But the first is to try every single day to connect with someone who you don't know. And what happens when you do that, right? As I'm walking around the streets of New York City and saying hi to people in a way that you're not supposed to do in a city like this, what that does for you is it breaks down those barriers of difference, right? It's not even about them, it's for your own perception and opening up a sense of a shared humanity. And that's been a really powerful spiritual experience for me. So one is connect with the people around you and start a practice where you try and do that once a day. And that can change your life. The second is to take another daily practice around action. And it doesn't have to be one that changes the world or one that changes our democracy even, but what is one single practice you will do every single day to help ensure equity, freedom, and justice for the people around you? Start local, start within your neighborhood, within your city, within your town, and start within a single thematic area, right? What do you care about? Where are your skills? What are you passionate about? What can you do? But if you just get into the habit of every day practicing doing that, I think that will go a long ways towards building an entire repertoire of what you can contribute.
Thanks, Simran. Jen or Mitch, what's one thing?
I have two ideas too that I'll share. One, and very similar to what Simran just said, is to make an active agreement to get to know and share coffee or whatever with someone you don't know. different community, different likeness. And I think that's something I did practice very well pre-COVID, but now it's a little more difficult, but hopefully that will come out. But I think even a more critical spot for people in my condition is to stand up for justice and truth within your own community. When you and your partners and people of like-mindedness, or evangelical Republicans and white Christians, is to say that's not what God says when you look at yourself as being superior. To take the act of courage to spread what I believe is the gospel and the good news of Christ within our own community, to try to break down some of those barriers from within our own community, which very much so is probably one of the most problematic in the United States, is to stand for what's right. So those are the two suggestions.
Thank you.
So I think we're going in twos, so maybe we'll get a total of 6 altogether before we wrap up today. I just had a baby 7 months ago. And so one of the things that's been really beautiful for me, because I'm extra, I put a sign outside because I couldn't show my baby off to the world that announced his, it announced his coming into the world. It was a stork. It was super cute, y'all. And it was amazing how many neighbors who I hadn't met, and I've lived in our house for over 4 years, dropped off banana bread and waved from the window. And so one of the things that this pandemic moment has taught me, and having a baby in a pandemic, which I don't know that I recommend, but happens sometimes, has taught me is the importance of getting to know my neighbors, which I hadn't done before. I also live in Nashville, Tennessee, where we've had a slew of extreme weather over the past year, from tornadoes to incredible storms and flooding. And it is in getting to know my neighbors that I've been able to check in on Miss Donna next door and some of the folks down the street. And so when it is safe to do so, I invite you to walk your block and knock on the door, and maybe it's bringing a treat or something, but introducing yourself to the people around you. And you would be surprised by the diversity that exists even within a block or two of your own house. So that would be offering number 1. Meet your neighbors and introduce yourself, which seems radical in these times, but it makes a difference. And then the second thing I would just invite folks to do is to take up the work of becoming a perpetual student. And so as new histories are being written, even now, picking up a book from someone who, even if you can't encounter difference because you live in a pretty monochromatic community, right? There's always available to us this thing called the internet and this thing called a bookstore where you can get the perspectives of many different people. And so I would invite you to, if it's once a week or once a month or once every 6 months, to pick up a book from somebody who's radically different than you are and whose worldview might be different, and dive in.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen and Simran and Mitch, for this great conversation that could go on a long time. Thank you for the particular and specific suggestions here at the end that we can all take away with us as we continue to shape our lives, to be a part of this democracy that in some ways has never yet been, but yet still can be. So have a great evening, and we look forward to being together again in the future. Take good care.
Thank you, Katharine. Thank you, everybody.